So I'm particularly excited to be here. From my point of view, she's the most important alumnus who went to Texas State. I'll actually be talking a little bit about the second most important Texas State grad, namely one Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the reason I want to talk about LBJ is not just because I like to kind of slam the hometown favorite, enjoyable though that might be, but it's also because LBJ is a kind of metaphor for something much bigger that's going on, not just in American politics, but also in American culture. To give you a brief idea of what I mean, right now, this very debate about LBJ and the Civil Rights Act, and did the two parties switch sides, and was Abraham Lincoln a progressive, and is the Republican Party the party of racism? All of this is reverberating right now in public in the head of one Kanye West. Kanye is sort of like one of these guys who tried to come out of the closet politically, and his fellows who are in the closet are trying to pull him back in. And so there's a kind of debate going on about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And this is a very important debate. It completely transcends Trump. It transcends the immediate politics. It's something that actually has more to do with what you learn in your textbooks and the great narrative of American history that is embedded in our head. It's out of that narrative that we get our ideas of right and wrong. Who are the villains and who are the heroes? Every time you see something on the History Channel about the Civil Rights Movement, there is a presumed narrative behind that. And it's that narrative that I'm going to call into question. And LBJ is my kind of lever, my entry point to do that. Now, many of you know that LBJ went to Howard University and gave a very famous speech which became, you could call it, the moral argument for affirmative action. LBJ basically said, you can't take a guy who has been hobbled by chains, who has been held back for years, who has been discriminated and segregated and earlier lynched and treated badly, and put him at the starting line along with everybody else and expect him to compete effectively. And what LBJ was suggesting is that there is a need for race-based preferences because some bad guys have been discriminating and mistreating blacks for many, many years. Now, scholars uniformly, progressive scholars in particular, uniformly celebrate this as a marvelous, eloquent defense of affirmative action. But it never occurs to anyone, or almost anyone, to ask this question. When LBJ was talking about blacks being humiliated, segregated, discriminated against, he never raised the question, who did that? And in fact, he never raised an even more important question, what was his actual role in doing that? LBJ, after all, was, certainly in his younger career, an outspoken racist. We now know, thanks to the Kennedy files, a fact that has almost stunned the historical community into silence, that LBJ was very likely a member of the Ku Klux Klan. An FBI agent named William Brannigan had documented proof, although he does not name his source, this agent, a very experienced agent, that LBJ was in the KKK. Now, this is not reported in any of the LBJ biographies. Doris Kearns Goodwin doesn't mention it. Robert Caro doesn't mention it. Even though he'd been following LBJ, you could almost call it day to day in a multi-volume heralded biography. This came as a bolt from the blue. But it's really not a surprise at all, because being in the KKK is completely consistent with LBJ's earlier career. He was part of the Southern bloc of Dixiecrat segregationists that voted to uphold segregation policies in the South, and not just segregation, anti-miscegenation laws, voted to block lynching laws that were being proposed by Republicans, and this is LBJ's career. And by the way, this is not really open to dispute. Progressive scholars admit this. LBJ was a racist. Here, however, is where things get really interesting, because the progressive narrative now works to try to rehabilitate LBJ. After all, this is the LBJ who pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and so we hear it implied that LBJ underwent a sort of magnificent conversion. Here was a guy we hear who sort of was a backwoods bigot, but he transcended that past. He became somebody who underwent a moral transformation, a kind of arc of justice, you might say. He flip-flopped. He did this volte-face. And that's why he championed the Civil Rights Act. Why else would he? Why else would he? Now, I begin by noting that this notion that LBJ underwent a moral transformation is completely refuted by the actual way that LBJ talked and behaved. And I want to give just 2 examples of this. I could give a dozen. In fact, I do give a dozen in a forthcoming book of mine. But I'm going to give just 2 here. This is a conversation between LBJ and Richard Russell. Richard Russell was LBJ's mentor, Southern segregationist Democrat. And LBJ says to Richard Russell, basically, the niggers. And you'll have to pardon my language. I'm going to use it a couple of times in my talk. Notice this is not my language. This is LBJ. Are getting very uppity. Very uppity. And he says, we got to do something about this. We got to give them a little something, but not enough to make a difference. And he's cajoling Richard Russell to join him in moving from a staunch segregationist position to a support for an earlier civil rights bill. This was before the Civil Rights Act of '64. But notice the language that he used, and notice the argument he makes. His argument is not, I've undergone a conversion, Richard, you need to see the light too. No, it's that I'm making a tactical move here to deal with some people who are getting, quote, uppity. This is LBJ. Now, you might say, well, that's in the 50s, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and therefore I now want to fast forward to 1965. This is the year after the Civil Rights Act. And now I'm quoting from Robert Caro's biography of LBJ, a conversation between LBJ and his own chauffeur, a guy named Robert Parker. LBJ says to Parker, would you like me to call you chief or nigger? Parker says, why don't you call me my name? And LBJ says, listen up, nigger. As long as you're black, which you're going to be black every single day of your life, I'll call you what I goddamn want to call you. He goes, you better get used to it, nigger. Just act as if you are a piece of furniture. End quote. LBJ. Now, I mentioned this not to shock you. From LBJ's point of view, there was nothing shocking. This was the way he was. But I highlight the date because honestly, if a man undergoes a conversion and becomes a champion of a landmark civil rights piece of legislation, you would not expect them to keep talking like this. It's kind of like if a guy, let's say, has a born-again experience, becomes a Christian, you expect them to speak differently, act differently, have a different set of values. Here's the point. People who undergo conversions usually give some evidence of it. When Whittaker Chambers, by the way, a famous figure of the 20th century, used to be a pro-Soviet, a communist, was actually a spy for the Soviet Union. When Whittaker Chambers became an anti-communist, he wrote a massively important book called Witness, describing his wrenching conversion, how difficult it was, how it lost him all his friends. Now, with LBJ, you have none of this. If LBJ underwent a conversion, he never told a soul. There's not a single statement in which LBJ even says, I changed my mind. I became a different person. This is the dog that didn't bark. Didn't bark. Now, all of this to me suggests that LBJ underwent no conversion. But it still remains for me to explain, why would somebody who underwent no conversion still champion the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Before I get there, I want to point out that this conversion of LBJ is of vital political importance to the left, to the progressives. Why? Because for the progressives, well, first of all, the three major progressives of the 20th century are Woodrow Wilson, FDR, LBJ. Woodrow Wilson was, again, quite likely in the Ku Klux Klan. We do know that his screening of a pro-KKK movie in the White House led to a massive nationwide revival of the Klan. It's often not pointed out that the Ku Klux Klan had gone defunct in the 1870s. There was no KKK. The KKK came back thanks to Woodrow Wilson, and it spread from Maine to California. The old Klan was in only 9 states. Woodrow Wilson did that. Now, it may sound funny for me to keep referring to these major figures being in the Klan. I do want to point out that if we were going through the Democratic Party, I would have to tell you that Woodrow Wilson was in the Klan, Harry Truman was in the Klan, and LBJ was in the Klan. Supreme Court justices like Hugo Black were longtime members, active members of the Klan. I mention this because there is nothing equivalent on the Republican side. Every time you keep hearing about David Duke, oh, what about David Duke? Well, here's the one guy who's excommunicate in the Republican Party. If you made a list of all the grand wizards, imperial dragons, cyclopses, local heads of the KKK over 100 years, I assure you that 99% of them were Democrats. Democrats. This is a fact. So, for progressives, as they look at, they've kind of become uneasy about Wilson. For reasons that I may or may not get to today, they're very uneasy about FDR, not only for interning the Japanese, but it's now coming to light that FDR was a fan of Mussolini. He sent members of his brain trust to fascist Italy to bring fascist ideas to America. FDR has a very checkered history. In fact, if I may point something out to you about FDR, and then I'm going to get back to LBJ, the whole block of Dixiecrat racists went to FDR, all Democrats, by the way, and FDR goes, I need your support for the New Deal. And they go on 2 conditions. Number 1, we have to design the New Deal to cut out blacks. Now, we can't say blacks, so let's exclude agricultural labor and domestic service, which happen to be the 2 professions in which blacks are heavily occupied. Let's exclude them from Social Security. Let's exclude them from New Deal benefits. FDR agreed. In fact, that's how the programs were written. Demand number 2. The Dixiecrats said to FDR, you must also agree to block all anti-lynching laws. Think about this. To block all anti-lynching laws. FDR agreed again, and worked behind the scenes to suppress anti-lynching legislation with the help of Northern Democrats. Northern Democrats. This is very important again because, as you know, in the progressive narrative, there are the following villains. America's to blame. The South is to blame. The white man is to blame. The North is always exempt. And interestingly, the Democratic Party is never mentioned. But all of this is a little bit of a scam. America's to blame? I mean, America doesn't do anything. Some Americans do things and other Americans fight them. So we have to get right to who are the actual bad guys. Now, let me turn to the progressive narrative itself. The progressive narrative goes sort of like this. Yes, it may be true that the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. This is usually said sort of in a mumble. Yeah, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. The extent of this, by the way, is never mentioned. And the extent of this is vast. By what this I mean, in 1860, the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Now notice I'm not saying no Republican leader owned a slave. I'm saying no Republican in the United States owned a slave. And this is really important because when I speak on campuses, very often some, professor of Romance languages at Bowdoin College will take me on. He goes, Dinesh, your talk is just a tad simplistic. You seem to be pointing the finger at the Democratic Party, but there's a lot of blame to go around. And part of the reason I point these facts out is there is not a lot of blame to go around. Now, the beauty of my statement about the Democratic Party and the slaves is this. There were 4 million slaves in 1860, and I'm saying that every one of them was owned by a Democrat. And this is a beautifully scientific statement because it's so refutable. All you have to do is give me the names of 3 Republicans who owned slaves, and I would have to take it back. But let me tell you that in the year and a half since I've made this statement, no successful counterexample has ever been mentioned. About 6 months ago, a PhD student wrote me. He goes, Dinesh, I think I got you. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave, a solitary slave, on his wife's side. And I said, buddy, that's kind of almost a touche, I'd have to call it, because at the time that this happened, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. Only later did he move into the Republican column. So the progressive narrative has to admit, when pressed against the wall by people who know their stuff, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. The Democratic Party was, yes, the party of segregation. And once again, let's be really clear, there's not a lot of blame to go around. Every segregation law in the South, without exception, in all those decades from the 1890s to the 1960s, every single law in every single state was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and enforced by Democratic officials. There is no exception to this rule. And then the Democrats have the honor of having started twice the Ku Klux Klan and made it an instrument of racial terror, actually very similar to the Nazi brown shirts. I say this because even though I appear to be throwing out an analogy, I'm really not. In the 1920s, Americans who went back and forth between, let's say, Mussolini's Italy in the 20s or Nazi Germany in the 30s and came to America would notice that on both sides of the pond, you've got similar organizations. Over here, the brown shirts. Notice that they're like into costumes, just like the Klan. Number 2, both groups have a membership of between 2 to 3 million. Large organizations. Both groups are into racial terrorism. Both groups pick on a vulnerable minority. In the Nazi case, Jews. In the KKK, blacks. And finally, both groups are not random, chaotic, vigilante groups. They are the organized military wing of a political party. Over here, the Nazi Party, and over here, the American Democratic Party. So this is the history. This history by itself is crushing because every time you have claims of racism, you'd have to always point the finger at the Democrats who did it. And so the progressives and the Democrats, closely allied at the hip right now, they realized we have to rewrite this story. We need to come up with a narrative that gets us off the hook. And so the narrative has several components, and I'm just going to hit them one by one. The first component is that the two parties switched sides. They traded platforms. Basically, the Republicans became Democrats, and the Democrats became Republicans. Now, I have to admit, for anyone who's not born yesterday, on the face of it, this is implausible. This would be like if I came to you and with a straight face I said, sometime in 1963, the cops all became robbers. And the robbers all became cops. They traded sides. You'd be like, what? How would that happen? Right? How would the two parties trade sides? Have they traded sides? Let's test that concept for a moment. Abraham Lincoln, in the 1850s, in discussing slavery, says that slavery can be described in a single phrase. You work, I eat. That's what slavery is. It's theft. You're ripping off another man's labor. And Lincoln says that this is not only the definition of slavery, but this is the platform of the Democratic Party in the North and in the South. The defense of this principle, including slavery. And then Lincoln says the Republican Party stands for the opposite. If the Democratic Party is you work, I eat, the Republican Party, Lincoln says, can be summarized in this way. The guy who makes the corn has the right to put the corn in his own mouth. In other words, people have a right to keep the fruit of their labor. So now let's fast forward 150 years, and I ask you, is it not a fact now that the core platform of the Republican Party, circa 2018, is in fact that the guy who makes the corn gets to eat the corn? And is it not a fact that although the parties have metamorphosed and there have been changes, which I don't deny, even so, in all these years later, would it be wrong to describe the core of the Democratic Party's platform now as summarized by the simple phrase, you work, I eat? Wealth confiscation, wealth redistribution, this guy works, but that guy gets stuff. That's still the Democratic Party we know. So the parties haven't actually switched sides. But the argument about the switch is a little more complex than that. It isn't just that the parties flipped. It's essentially that blacks became Democrats because they saw that Democrats are the party of civil rights. So blacks did switch. They used to be Republicans. They became Democrats. And the argument goes, the reason they did is their eyes were opened to who is the true friend of blacks now. And the second part of that story is that the Republicans now dominate the South. In other words, the South switched. It went from being overwhelmingly Democratic, which it was, to being heavily Republican, which it is, and that was due to racism. In other words, the idea here is Nixon's Southern strategy. Nixon, Tricky Dick, according to this narrative, went down south and rounded up the racists, the Dixiecrats, the people against civil rights. He whispered in their ear, he campaigned to them, and they became Republicans. The Dixiecrats, racists, became Republicans. And the Republican Party is now defined by this commitment to racism and white supremacy. This is the narrative I now want to zoom in on. And kind of hope that Kanye West is listening here, because this will clear up a lot of things in his head. First of all, when did blacks switch parties? If the progressive narrative is right, blacks would have to switch parties in the 60s or the 70s. LBJ champions the Civil Rights Act. Blacks go, oh wow, he's our friend, and they move over to the Democratic camp. In fact, the black move occurred in the 1930s. So in 1932, when FDR first ran against Herbert Hoover, he only got 1/3 of the black vote. But literally 4 years later, in 1936, FDR got 71% of the black vote. The black vote switched from Republican to Democrat in the 30s. Now, in the 30s, this is not even open for debate, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation and the KKK. So you might ask, why did blacks leave the party of Lincoln and emancipation and join the party of the Klan? And the short answer is, it's kind of a sad answer, it's the terrible economic pressure of the Depression. So that even though FDR discriminated against blacks, cut him out of New Deal programs, essentially gave them crumbs. Those crumbs were more than no crumbs. And so blacks began to move over, not because of race, not because of FDR was the friend of civil rights, but because of the economic benefits of the New Deal. I don't blame them, but it contradicts the progressive narrative that blacks understood who their civil rights pals were. No, That's not why blacks switched. Now, why did the South